It was October 1962. American families huddled around televisions, sirens were tested, and school children practiced duck-and-cover drills beneath their desks. In the deep waters of the Caribbean, Soviet ships approached a line drawn not just on a map, but between two worldviews. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't merely a geopolitical standoff. It was a moment when the very fabric of human belief strained to hold the weight of atomic fear. And that fear wasn't just about missiles. It was about meaning, about how we, as a species, ought to live. Because behind the hardware, behind the warheads and submarines and military maneuvers, there was something far more ancient and invisible at play. A clash of philosophies. On one side, capitalism, grounded in the sanctity of individual liberty, private property, and the free pursuit of happiness. On the other, communism, born from dreams of collective justice, equality, and a world without the chains of class or capital. So we must ask, was the Cold War really just a chessboard of superpowers? Or was it something deeper? A silent war of ideas, of competing visions of what it means to be human, to be free, to belong? Because while tanks rolled and treaties were signed, the true battleground stretched across minds, cultures, and generations. This wasn't just a fight over land. It was a struggle for the soul of the future. And to understand it, we have to begin at the roots, where capitalism's vision of the self first took shape. To understand the capitalist worldview that shaped one side of the Cold War, we need to return to the Enlightenment, an age when philosophers dared to ask, what is a human being without a king? Without a master? Without the state pressing down upon their soul? Enter John Locke, whose words echoed like a liberation spell through the halls of history. Locke believed that every human being had natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Not gifts from rulers, not permissions from governments, but rights, inalienable, sacred. To own yourself, to own your labor, and to own the fruits of it, that was the foundation of freedom. Then came Adam Smith, who saw in free exchange not just economics, but ethics. In his eyes, the invisible hand of the market wasn't cold or cruel. It was the product of individual choice. When people were free to pursue their self-interest, he argued, they unknowingly contributed to the good of all. It was a radical faith that freedom, not control, would lead to prosperity. That competition could bring harmony. That human progress would arise not from orders, but from options. These ideas became pillars of classical liberalism: individual liberty, private property, free markets, limited government. And by the time the Second World War ended, they had found their most powerful disciple, the United States. America didn't just rebuild itself after the war. It crowned itself the champion of freedom. Not only freedom of speech or worship or vote, but freedom to work, to earn, to buy, to build. Capitalism wasn't just an economy. It was a moral compass, pointing toward autonomy and self-determination. The American dream was more than a slogan. It was a vision exported like jazz or jeans, that anyone, from anywhere, could rise through talent and tenacity. That liberty meant not just being free from tyranny, but free to chase your own definition of success. And this, perhaps more than any treaty or border, defined the West's stance in the Cold War. A belief in the sovereign self and in the market as the ultimate expression of human will. But while capitalism built itself on the sanctity of the individual, its rival envisioned something entirely different, where the self was never separate from the whole. If capitalism was born from the promise of personal freedom, communism arose from the wound that freedom often failed to heal. In the smoke-choked cities of 19th century Europe, amid the rise of factories and fortunes, two thinkers looked out at a world where wealth bloomed for the few and suffering deepened for the many. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels didn't just see poverty. They saw a system designed to produce it. Their critique wasn't about envy. It was about justice. about the conviction that no one should grow rich off the backs of the exploited. At the heart of their vision was a theory called historical materialism. They believed that human history wasn't random. It followed patterns. Each era, each revolution, was shaped by material conditions and class struggle. From feudalism to capitalism, power had always belonged to the ruling class. But Marx predicted that capitalism carried within it the seed of its own undoing, that the working class, the proletariat, would one day rise, not in envy, but in clarity, to reclaim what was always theirs, their labor, their dignity, their future. Communism, as Marx envisioned it, wasn't just an economic alternative. It was a total reimagining of human relationships. No private property, no hierarchies of power, no alienation between the worker and their work. Instead, collective ownership, shared prosperity, and a world where no one would need to sell their soul just to survive. The Soviet Union would later take these ideals and mold them into a system of governance. The state, according to Leninist doctrine, was a necessary phase, a tool to protect the revolution until the day it could wither away into a true classless society. In theory, the Soviet experiment was a journey toward utopia. In practice, it often meant control, censorship, and repression. But in its self-image, it remained the torchbearer of equality. To its supporters, the USSR stood for the forgotten, the voiceless, the downtrodden. It offered an answer to the cruelty of unregulated markets. It claimed to value we over me, community over competition, and justice over profit. And so, where America exalted the freedom of the individual, the Soviet Union uplifted the dignity of the collective. These weren't just different politics, they were different philosophies, different answers to the question, what makes a good society? With such radically different visions of what humanity should be, these two systems couldn't simply coexist. They had to compete. Once the ideologies were in place, the Cold War quickly became more than a standoff between two superpowers. It became a global campaign to win minds, reshape systems, and spread beliefs. And this wasn't just about military alliances. It was about philosophical conversions. For the United States, promoting capitalism wasn't only about economic expansion, it was a moral imperative. The Marshall Plan, launched in the aftermath of World War II, poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe. But this wasn't just aid, it was ideology in disguise. By helping nations recover through market-driven development, America hoped to make capitalism synonymous with freedom, prosperity, and progress. NATO, too, was more than a military pact. It was a philosophical alliance, a shared commitment to democracy, liberalism, and individual rights. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had its own gospel to spread. Through the Comintern and other arms of influence, Moscow sought to nurture revolutions, train ideologues, and seed movements from Cuba to Vietnam to Angola. Communist education, art, and literature were exported not as culture, but as doctrine. In every proxy conflict, from Korea to Afghanistan, the fight wasn't just over land, it was over the meaning of justice, equality, and order. Both sides understood that power wasn't only about armies, it was about ideas. So the Cold War was fought not only in jungles and deserts, but in books, films, classrooms, and kitchens. Yes, kitchens. In 1959, then Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced off in what became known as the kitchen debate. Standing in a model American home, Nixon praised the efficiency and freedom of capitalist domestic life, while Khrushchev countered with the virtues of collective well-being and technological parity. It wasn't a debate about appliances. It was about ideals, about whose system could offer the better life. Propaganda flourished. Hollywood and Soviet cinema competed to paint their worlds as humane, righteous, and victorious. Aid became a weapon of influence. Universities became battlegrounds of ideology. Every investment, every alliance, every treaty was a move in a deeper philosophical chess game. Because in the Cold War, nations weren't just choosing sides, they were choosing worldviews. aligning not just their armies, but their hearts and hopes. Yet this wasn't just about ideas. It was about survival. And in an age where one push of a button could end the world, philosophy itself became a matter of life and death. As the Cold War escalated, something deeply irrational began to define the logic of both superpowers. The more they feared annihilation, the more they built the very weapons that could bring it about. At the heart of this paradox was a doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And while it sounds like a military strategy, it was, in many ways, a philosophical confession. MAD held that if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with equal or greater force, ensuring total destruction on both sides. The only way to survive was to make war unthinkable. To guarantee peace, both had to hold the power to obliterate the other. It was deterrence through terror, rationality through insanity. A high-stakes game of chicken played with the fate of the planet. But what's more haunting is how this doctrine wasn't just about missiles. It was about mindsets. About a world where dialogue gave way to dogma and coexistence became a weakness. The nuclear arms race wasn't only fueled by fear, it was fueled by philosophical rigidity. Each side was so committed to its vision of truth, capitalist autonomy on one hand, collectivist order on the other, that compromise became treason. These weapons, though forged from science, were born from belief, from a refusal to acknowledge that the other system might hold a sliver of value, from a worldview that said, if you are not like us, you are a threat to us. Underneath the warheads was an ethical divide. In the West, freedom was often exalted even at the cost of inequality or chaos. In the East, security and equality were upheld, even if it meant surveillance, suppression, or sacrifice. The arms race, in that sense, was not just political brinkmanship. It was a mirror reflecting incompatible answers to fundamental human questions. What is worth protecting? Who decides what is right? And how much control is too much? But these weren't just abstract questions debated in war rooms. They began to echo through daily life, in classrooms, in films, in the silence of censored books and the roar of national anthems. Because these worldviews didn't just clash globally, they seeped into people's lives, shaping everything from art to identity. The Cold War wasn't just fought with tanks or treaties. It was fought in pages and poems, on film reels and airwaves. It was a battle for the human soul, waged not only in politics, but in culture. In the United States, freedom became the defining narrative. Hollywood embraced it with open arms, producing stories where the lone individual triumphed over oppressive systems. From cowboy westerns to sci-fi space operas, the message was clear. Liberty is heroic. Choice is sacred. The self is sovereign. Writers like Ayn Rand turned capitalism into almost a spiritual path, portraying the independent thinker as a moral beacon and collectivism as a slow decay of the human spirit. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union crafted its own stories. Through socialist realism, artists and writers were expected to depict a glorious present and an even brighter future, where the individual's highest purpose was to serve the collective good. The scientist, the farmer, the soldier, all were noble because they gave themselves to something greater. Art wasn't expression, it was instruction. But beneath these polished surfaces ran deeper, darker currents. In the US, McCarthyism turned suspicion into policy. To question capitalism too loudly, to speak too openly about socialism or communism, was to risk being blacklisted, interrogated, erased. Fear of infiltration wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. It turned neighbors into spies and dissent into danger. In the USSR, censorship was absolute. The state dictated what could be published, painted, or performed. Religion was stifled and atheism institutionalized, not as belief, but as control. Thought itself became regulated. Yet in both worlds, cracks appeared, through the voices of those who refused to be confined. Writers like Solzhenitsyn, Camus, and Orwell gave us existential truths neither system wanted to face. Absurdism and existentialism emerged not from apathy, but from the inability of grand ideologies to answer the small, intimate questions of human suffering, doubt, and hope. These movements asked, what happens when the system fails to make us whole? Because eventually, people stop cheering for the ideology and start asking what it costs to believe in it. And slowly, despite the deep divide, cracks began to form. Not just in walls, but in the philosophies themselves. For decades, the Cold War was sustained by conviction, by two systems so certain of their righteousness that doubt was seen as betrayal. But even the strongest ideologies over time begin to reveal their fractures. And when those cracks appear, they don't just shake governments, they unsettle the very foundations of belief. In the capitalist world, the promise of freedom came with a price. Yes, markets created wealth, but they also bred inequality. As skyscrapers rose, so did poverty lines. The individual, once celebrated, began to feel isolated, alienated by systems that reduced human worth to productivity and profit. Consumerism promised meaning through material goods, but it often left people emptier than before. Freedom became entangled with excess and liberty with loneliness. In the communist world, the contradictions were just as glaring. The dream of a classless society turned into a reality of repression. Progress stalled, innovation slowed under the weight of bureaucracy. The utopia never arrived, and instead of liberation, many experienced surveillance, fear, and the silencing of dissent. The collective ideal began to feel like a cage. History, too, started to shift. The Prague Spring of 1968, where Czechoslovakians called for socialism with a human face, was brutally crushed, but the spirit of resistance endured. The Solidarity movement in Poland offered a glimpse of worker-led democracy within a communist context. The Soviet-Afghan War drained morale and exposed the limits of ideological expansion. And then came Gorbachev, with glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, words that signaled not just policy changes, but philosophical exhaustion. People on both sides of the Iron Curtain began to hunger for something more flexible, more human. The age of absolutes gave way to the age of nuance. Pluralism, pragmatism, and hybrid systems started to replace ideological purity. Nations stopped asking, which side are you on? And started asking, what works for us? Because when belief hardens into dogma, it eventually forgets the very people it claims to serve. So what remains of this war of ideas, and what does it still mean for us today? The Cold War may be over, but its philosophies are far from gone. They've simply changed their costumes and adapted to new stages. In the United States, the emphasis on free markets and personal liberty still shapes much of its political and cultural identity. The idea that success is earned, that the individual should be left alone to choose their path, remains central to its self-image, even as debates over inequality, healthcare, and social justice continue to complicate that narrative. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China offers a fascinating paradox. It has embraced elements of capitalism, markets, entrepreneurship, global trade, while maintaining a tightly controlled, centralized political system. It's neither wholly capitalist nor communist. Instead, it reflects a hybrid born from Cold War legacies, where control and commerce coexist in uneasy tension. And around the world, we're seeing echoes of the same old divide. The rise of authoritarian regimes, the backlash against liberal democracies, the increasing polarization of societies. All of it feels like the ideological aftershocks of a war we never fully processed. We're still wrestling with the same questions. How much freedom is too much? How much order is too little? Who gets to decide what justice looks like? Perhaps the greatest lesson the Cold War leaves us is this. Philosophy without empathy becomes dangerous. A system that forgets the soul of the human being, even if it starts with noble intentions, can become its own kind of tyranny. because political structures, no matter how elegant in theory, must always bend toward dignity, compassion, and the quiet, unmeasurable truths of being human. In the end, the Cold War wasn't just a standoff of weapons or a shadow game of spies. It was a confrontation between two visions of what it means to be human, two systems trying to answer the same fundamental question: how should we live? One pointed to the individual, his freedom, his ambition, his right to dream without limits. The other pointed to the collective, its harmony, its equality, its promise to lift all together. And maybe, just maybe, the Cold War wasn't truly won by either side. Maybe it was lost by both in their refusal to listen, to bend, to evolve. In their obsession with being right, they often forgot to be wise. Because when philosophy hardens into ideology, it loses its soul. And in that loss, something essential, something deeply human, is left behind.